Tom Campbell here. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you and enjoy the video.
Good afternoon and welcome to Tom Campbell Answers Your Questions. Tom, we're going to start with a question from Mario, and this is about the double slit experiment. Imagine the double slit experiment was scaled up to visible objects being hurled at a big barrier with two openings. For example, ink-covered basketballs being rapid-fired and some of them making it through the gaps to a wall behind the initial barrier. If we ran this experiment but nobody was looking, what would we find on the back wall after it was all over? A diffraction pattern or two piles of ink blots corresponding to the two openings? What would it show?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that's been thought about. And we've not gotten things as large as basketballs yet to work at this double slit, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But we have gotten things even much bigger than buckyballs. Buckyballs are sort of a 60 atom carbon molecule called buckyballs that kind of looks like a soccer ball. You know, if you would look at it, you know, it's got many little facets on the sides. And there has been things that have been many times bigger than that, some larger molecules. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a larger molecule that was like 10 or 20 or 100 times bigger than buckyballs. And they got an interference pattern, just like the buckyballs did. So the theory tells us, if we look at the theory, it tells us that this double slit arrangement, that if you send particles through double slits and you don't measure any which way data, that you will get an interference pattern, right? Now that's what we see when we do that. It should work for any size particle. That includes basketballs, toasters, cement trucks, you know, anything, any size thing it should work for. Yes, cement trucks. You should be able to drive cement trucks at those double slits and find them in a interference pattern. But you would have to meet all the conditions for the double slit experiment. And just having a gun that shoots cement trucks or basketballs does not meet those conditions. Okay, there are conditions of uncertainty that the laser spitting out photons satisfies that the basketballs don't. So we have been able to go scale up bigger and bigger particles, but in general, what the theory will tell you is that though it is theoretically possible to see those cement trucks end up in an interference pattern, it is not practical. You know, it's not something that is doable. There's no way that we can actually meet the conditions of the double slit experiment with cement trucks. You know, it's like a lot of things are that way, that are theoretically possible, but practically, you know, when I say practically, I mean that in a practical application, you can't do them, even though they're theoretically possible. They don't, it's not something that you can make happen here. And that's one of them. So yes, basketballs, cement trucks, you know, probably entire, building complexes. It doesn't matter. There is no limit on the size as far as the theory goes, if you can meet all the conditions. Now, to use something as big as basketballs, those basketballs would have to be coming at an extremely high velocity from extremely far away in order to meet the conditions. You see, and anyway, I guess we'll just leave it at that. We won't go into the details, but it's theoretically possible to get a diffraction, or I shouldn't say diffraction, interference pattern from any particle. But everything would have to be scaled up to the right way, and you'd have to meet all of the conditions, which is really impossible. I don't think we'll ever drive cement trucks through a double slit and have them end up in some kind of a interference pattern, even though it is theoretically possible. It's just can't be arranged. There's no way that you can meet all the criteria to actually make that happen. Yeah, it's just out of bounds as far as what we can do, but it's not a theoretical impossibility. You know, it's like the making a virtual reality from the bottom up. You know, modeling every single elementary particle to build up atoms, to build up neutrons, and then build up atomic particles and build up molecules and so on. We could build up a whole reality that way. Theoretically, that can be done. Practically, no, that'll never happen. It's too much, too many particles. It's the same thing with many worlds theory, right? Okay, every time some particle somewhere goes from a spin up to a spin down, we'll generate a whole new universe. Well, think of it. There's any time there's probably a quadrillion particles changing spin up to spin down, and every one of those will then have quadrillion universes, and every one of those quadrillion universes will have a quadrillion particles going up and down, and we'll have to make new quadrillions of each one of those quadrillions. And you see, it just gets out of hand so fast that it gets silly. So even though it's theoretically possible that you could have such a concept, it isn't a practical thing. It isn't something that'll actually ever happen. It's not something that'll be done. And it's not, well, if we just had fast enough computers or something, we could do that. No, it is not a practical thing. It just doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. It doesn't make good sense. So there's a lot of things like that are theoretically possible, but you just can't take them to that limit. There's limitations about how far you can scale things up and still have it to be doable. But we've put some pretty big chunks of matter through the double slits, and they do end up in interference patterns. Something, like I say, I think it was 10 or 100 or something times bigger. You can Google that. What's the biggest particle that's been used in the double slit experiment? I'm sure you can find that, but it was some kind of a big molecule. I'm not sure whether it was an organic molecule or not. Now, I read it, I don't know, a decade ago, so I don't remember the details.
Was that the Italians that did that experiment?
I'm not sure. It's just, I noted it as, yeah, that's interesting, but I didn't really memorize it because one knows that, yes, of course, that could be done. But they were able to meet all the criteria of that experiment. And if you do that, yes, basketballs, cement trucks, all of those will work if you meet that criteria. You just can't meet that criteria, probably even with basketballs, much less cement trucks.
All right. Thank you very much for that answer, Tom. That was a fun question. Our next question comes from Marzim. Greetings, Tom. I was wondering in MBT if the databases can ever get too full. For example, if you take all of the IUOCs that exist and skip to gazillions of lifetimes from now for each of us, will the LCS have to manage the databases because there's too much information for it to handle? Does it just keep going on no matter how much data and information exists? Think of huge amounts of IUOCs, billions of them, that may not even have an avatar on Earth as well, and each of them have trillions of lifetimes or more. Will it reach a point where there's too much for the LCS and it has to throw experience out that are not important to its growth?
Well, that's a reasonable question, but remember, the larger conscious system is an aware, intelligent, conscious system. It has to make choices. It's not a machine that has to always do the same thing all the time in every case. It can make adjustments as it goes with what's practical. It's not an infinite system, so it doesn't have infinite resources. It's finite. Now, it may be very large. To us, it may seem infinite, but it is finite. So it will make choices when it has to make those choices. Now, I would say that it doesn't save everything forever, or it doesn't save, it's not like it can't delete things. Okay? It can delete things. And as information becomes useless, let's say, becomes highly unlikely that it will, be of any consequence in the future, then that is probably deleted. Now, yes, there has to be thresholds. Who judges what is of consequence and what isn't? Who judges if that information is valuable or not? Well, the system does. The system does. It sets criteria. Now, here's an example. Let's say that, 100,000 years ago, that's about halfway between now and when Homo sapiens started first walking around on this planet. So let's say about 100,000 years ago, there was some Homo sapien, named Grog. And let's say, he lived for 25 years, which is probably about as long as people lived in those days, maybe 30 years. And he did all sorts of things. He, I don't know, hunted, he gathered, he, mated, he lived a full life for all those years, was a busy guy. Now, does the system still have Grog's personal data, that's available? Can we look up in the database and follow Grog's, everyday things? Do we know what Grog had for lunch, the Tuesday before he died? All that kind of information obviously is no longer important if it's detailed information about Grog. Nobody knows what any of that information could possibly be. Therefore, we don't have to keep it in detail, but we could keep it in a statistical sense. And that is, if you wanted to know what life in general was like 100,000 years ago, the system could show you a little movie about that, about what it was like. You could gather some information, but none of that information would necessarily be accurate in every detail. It would just be, this is sort of how it was then kind of information, you see? So it would be, I don't know what you call those things, kind of a documentary, but not actually, what do they call it? Historical fiction? Maybe that's what they call it, right? It'd be historical fiction, yeah. And that is that it wouldn't be exactly true, but it would be a very good likeness of what things were like then. So now that could be kept. So instead of trillions of records for every, Homo sapien and Neanderthal and whatever else was walking around making choices in those days, it just kind of keeps the general notion of how that was. So sure, it deletes data as it goes. And it's the same with us. For instance, I usually use this, if I sitting here talking to you, and while I talk to you, I do this, stretch my head with my right hand, or maybe I do this and stretch my head with my left hand. Would the system save that? Well, what the system would do, they'd look and say, well, how important a thing was that? What did it change downstream? What part of reality was modified because he scratched his head with his right hand rather than his left hand? And the answer to that would be nothing. There isn't anything downstream that is affected by that. It was more or less junk information. It just happened. So would the system want to keep that? 100 years from now, somebody want to know, well, Tom was talking to Donna on that particular day, that particular hour, that particular day. Which hand did he scratch his head with? Well, the system at that point would just say, well, it's a 50-50 chance that we'll just give him, right hand, and that's what we'll tell him. So again, you just get a statistical representation of what actually happened, because that's not important information. So I think as it goes, the system is smart enough not to load up its databases with trash information. Now, occasionally, it will make a mistake. Occasionally, it'll throw something out that it thought was trash, and then later, that actually will make a difference. Somebody will care about that. And in which case, well, it's just lost. All it can do is give them kind of the statistical, the historical fiction, if you like, something that was similar. So
There's
sometimes,
no recycle bin, huh?
no, there's no there's no bin that is going to go back and bring it back out of, right? It's gone. So sometimes it will do that, but it looks at it and says, well, where's the break line there? If I'm going to make less than this many mistakes, then how do I cut it off? So we call that kind of decision-making expert system. An expert system sets criteria and says if the criteria is that, we're looking at future probabilities, right? And this action of scratching my head doesn't affect any future probabilities. It doesn't change any future probability anywhere it can see. Well, then it's not important. If it's something I do, a choice I make that affects other people, then it'll change. It'll change the probabilities. Because I did A rather than B, the probabilities now all shift because that was a meaningful choice. And, I marry Sally instead of marrying Sue. Well, that's going to set a whole lot of people off in a different direction. Just that choice. So that would be important. But whether I scratch my head with my right hand or my left hand on a particular day doesn't affect the future probable database. Now, it creates this future probable database. So we can look at it and say, okay, what's the probability that somebody will be doing a study on the hand someone uses to scratch their head with? And because that's been found to have a great, deep psychological meaning attached to it. People who scratch their hand with their right hand are this way, and people who scratch their head with their left hand are some other way. And that becomes a real significant point. Well, now it might keep some of that data because it could actually change things, the way people assess things. Then it might be important. But if it's not important, it's not kept. So the database doesn't keep everything forever. It keeps what it needs for now. And then when now becomes so far distant that there's no longer anyone to ask. That's like the case of the 100,000-year-old person. There isn't anybody alive that can say, oh, Grog was my great grandfather, and I'd like to know something about him. Nobody's going to ask that. Nobody actually knows that this guy ever lived, as a single individual. So now he's just lumped up as a group with other people that lived in around that time, plus or minus probably 500 years. They're probably all grouped up kind of together, plus or minus 500 years, because plus or minus 500 years, nothing really changed much. So that's the way the database does it. It does throw out data, and it throws it out all along. In the present, in the past, it throws out stuff that nobody will access. Maybe it just looks at that data and says, well, so many years have gone by and there's never been any access. So we'll just dump that because nobody's going to ask for it. If they do, if somebody says, well, I want to know about Grog, or I want to know about my great whatever grandfather, then they'll come up with something that is approximately true. So that's why often when people do out of bodies and they go through a place that's familiar to them, let's say they go out of body in their bedroom, and then they go out through the door, down the stairs, walk through the hallway into their living room, and they notice that the vase of flowers is sitting on the piano, not on the desk, by the door. And they say, well, that's odd. That vase should be sitting on the desk at the door. And I saw it sitting on the piano. Why? Because evidently it was about a 50-50 chance where that vase might be sitting, and it really wasn't all that important. So what they're getting is just something that is likely to be true, but not necessarily true. So little details like that move around when we get data out of the databases, when we remote view. That's also just getting data out of the databases. And when we do that, sometimes things shift around a little bit. They're not always exactly the way they are. And the things that are out of line or not where they should be, those are things that just aren't important. It doesn't matter where they are. It doesn't drive anything in the future. So that answers the question, is that it doesn't keep all that information. And if it goes on until, its databases are getting full till it doesn't have a whole lot of bits left to work with, then it will find other ways to cut, or it will cut more drastically, or it'll change those thresholds at which stuff gets thrown away and make it throw more stuff away. Now, on the other hand, it's not true that the number of seats in the VR games, like the VR game that we call, the physical universe, that has right now, 7.75 billion seats in it. That's how many humans there are. And it's got a lot of seats in it that don't need as much attention, such as dogs and cats and horses and porcupines and bumblebees. It's got those too, but that decision space in those entities is much smaller. So it's much less overhead, to keep up with them. The decision space, all the kind of things we can do and how we can interact, is much bigger with the humans. So the humans are more overhead to the rendering engine for the virtual reality. The rendering engine has to work harder to maintain the human avatars than it does, say, to maintain a cat avatar. Okay, so that's why I'm just going to use humans now. Not that I'm discriminating against all the conscious critters, but we kind of drive the computer usage. So you have all these humans. So there's going to be some point where you don't need any more seats. In other words, every system, no matter what the system is, every system has a point of diminishing returns where more is not better. Whatever you're building, whatever you're doing, if you start out and do something, maybe more of that is better, and more is better. Let's say you're making widgets. More widgets are better because there's a big market for widgets. Billions of people need widgets, and there's only a few widgets in the world. So more are better because you can sell them. So more and more and more, and you continue, but you'll get to some point where more widgets are not better because the demand's dropped off, because everybody wants a widget, already has one. So now just making more and more and more of them is going to create losses. It's more trouble to make them, and you can't sell them for much anymore. You see, so every system is like that, not just economic systems, but every system. And this virtual reality is like that too. How many players do you need? Okay, so if 7.75 billion players is good, if you add one more, have 7.75 billion players plus one more, is the value that you get in entropy reduction out of that worth the expense of creating one more data stream and having to keep up with one more avatar's interactions with the other avatars? See, that takes the system, has to compute all that. So if it says, no, just that one extra isn't going to really reduce entropy that much, it's just going to be trivial, but the cost to the system to maintain that, to have a player play that and maintain it, that costs the system something. It's got to create another IUOC. That IUOC's, has to create a free will awareness unit that has to log on, plus all those interactions. So it's a lot of overhead. So it just won't go on forever. When adding more takes more resources than it gives back, it makes it a bad investment. And the system will curtail that. Now, maybe the system said, well, okay, I started this system. I'll go ahead, even though it's not efficient anymore, I'll go ahead and let it run its course. Or the system could say, well, what we need here is a flood, a big earthquake. We need an asteroid to slam into it or something, so we can reduce those numbers because there's too many. It costs more than it's worth at that value. So hard to say. The system can make those kinds of arrangements. It can do what it needs to do. So I expect that the system will stay efficient. It's not going to just drive itself into the ground to where it can't function anymore because it wasn't smart enough to set limits. It will set limits. And it may be that, some virtual reality it's got going that's not doing very well. may just be terminated. That could be a possibility. Say, well, we don't need that one anymore. That one's just never was functional, never did do very well. So you may just stop that one. That's a possibility too. Take all those entities and let them, move into other virtual realities, other places. So now you got less overhead. You have the same number of IUOCs, but you have one less virtual reality to maintain.
So we need to stay on our toes unless we want to be going to some strange reality frame that we don't know how it works. Anyway,
right. So
that
everybody needs to stay on their toes, do the best they can. They need to be successful in this growing up thing, and then they will be right up there at the top of the list for maintenance, right? They'll be earning their keep, lowering entropy. Right.
Tom, that was another fun, interesting question. Well answered. Thank you. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. One of my more significant, this is from Satori 5. This next question is from Satori 5. One of my more significant experiences out of body was visiting a house. It was sort of a way station for travelers. When I arrived there, there was a definite sense of well-being and love. There were many entities interacting with each other and doing their own thing. I was introduced to a woman on the top floor of this house who the other entity is referred to as the mother. The room was a work setting and everything seemed very physical. She even showed me a physical device she was using to heal people, and this was some kind of healthcare setting. They interacted with me, but clearly were interacting in a physical space as well. If this was not a single player game, is it possible that there are VRs that can support the presence of both physical and less physical entities at the same time? Or is it possible that it was all very non-physical and I only interpreted it as physical to accommodate my own prior experiences in this VR? And he follows that up with, how can we differentiate between multiplayer games like our physical universe and single player games generated by the LCS?
Well, it's very difficult to make that determination unless you live there. If you live there, it would be a little easier. If you just visit, it's pretty hard, maybe even impossible. See, if it's a single player game, then everything else is an NPC. Well, the NPC is simply the system playing the character. Well, what are you and I but the system playing a character, right? What's an IUOC? It's a subset of the system. You see, so when they say, well, is it multiplayer of the system playing characters, or is it just the system playing characters? You see, it's why it's so hard to tell, because it's pretty much the same thing going on here. All right, the difference is that in the IUOC has its own free will, whereas if you have the system playing all the characters, then it's the system's free will being represented in all the characters. Now, is there a way that you can tell the difference between that, between whether it's a character's free will or whether that character's choices, which seem indeed like they're free will choices, is the free will actually the free will of the system, of the LCS? That's what you'd have to differentiate between them. And that's a pretty difficult thing to differentiate. You're not going to tell that, certainly, unless you live there long enough that you can find a pattern in all the NPCs, have a tendency to be this way. Well, that would represent that they all had the same source of their free will, where they all played this sort of thing. But even that would be hard, because just to make it seem more real, the system wouldn't do that. It would make some of its NPCs all kinds of different ways. They wouldn't. It would mix it up and make it different enough that it would be very difficult for you to tell. Now, why would it go to that trouble? Because a good virtual reality is one in which you cannot tell that it's a virtual reality. That's the definition. Matter of fact, a perfect virtual reality is one that's impossible to tell that it's a virtual reality. Now, there probably aren't any perfect virtual realities. There's probably always little telltale signs here and there, like maybe the double slit experiment. See, that meant they'd be a little telltale sign, that it doesn't work that way, or other things that happen here, like people with no brains being very smart and getting high, getting advanced degrees in mathematics, even though they've only got a quarter of an inch of matter, brain matter around the inside of their skull, and that's all the brain they've got. But in any case, there's anomalies that sometimes will give you a little hint that this looks like a virtual reality, because these things just don't make sense. They're just, we can't explain them very well. But in a virtual reality, anything can happen. So if it's a virtual reality, well, that explains all of them. Any sort of thing can happen. All you have to do is put the right data in a data stream, and there it is in that virtual reality. So I think you probably just couldn't tell. And if you can't tell, then you must come to the conclusion that it doesn't matter. You're there and you're interacting. So it doesn't really matter. They're all, any virtual reality you're in, whether it's a single player or multiplayer game, the point of that game is that you make choices, and by those choices, you evolve or de-evolve the quality of your consciousness, period. The details of the reality really are irrelevant, doesn't matter. You make choices in a single player game, they affect your quality. You make it in a multiplayer game, it affects your quality just the same. It's not like you get double points if it's a multiplayer game, it's all the same. So then just inquiring egos want to know, if it's just something that you want to know because you're curious, well, you probably won't know. System makes good virtual reality, so it's really hard to tell, what the system's doing and why it's doing it. Even if the system just gives you information and you go out and get information and you bring it back, is that information actually true and accurate? Or is that what the system thought that would help me learn by giving me this information? It thought that that would be, trigger some learning, it'd trigger an opportunity in dealing with that information. You don't really know. So that's why I say you always are, both open-minded, yes, but also skeptical. So you have to be skeptical of everything. Don't come to conclusions. This must be this kind of a virtual reality, and the system gave me this information. It must be accurate because the system only gives accurate information. Maybe, maybe not. Depends the purpose of the system and what the system may be doing. The system there is primarily to help us evolve more effectively and efficiently. That doesn't necessarily always mean handing us things that are absolutely correct. It could be handing us something that will challenge us into growing up. Well, that's the point here. The point here is to get us to grow up. So you must always be skeptical of everything, and you must always make your own choices with your own free will. Don't let anybody else or any other entity, no matter how wise, no matter how knowledgeable and how experienced, don't let anybody make your choices for you. Listen to what others have to say, take all that into consideration, and then make your own choice based on your own experience. And just copying somebody else, the big guru knows everything, so if he says do this, I'll do it. It's a bad idea. You have to say, what does my experience say? What does my understanding say? And then you do that. And then you look back at it and see, well, was that a good choice or a bad choice? And you learn from it. That's how you grow up. If you're just copying somebody else because you think they're wise, you're not going to learn from that. It's not valuable to you. It's not a good way to go. So always make your own choices. Even if you know somebody else that's wiser than you could probably make better choices, doesn't matter. Make your own choices. That's how you grow up. That's how you evolve. The point isn't to be right. The point is to grow. It's to become. It's to learn. So you won't know because the system makes good virtual realities, and they are virtually impossible to tell that they're virtually, that they're virtual realities. So there's a lot of things when it comes to consciousness that's like that. You never know for sure what you got or why you've got it. So you just take it, deal with it in the most profitable way possible, and go on and learn from it.
But dealing with it from your own decision space, your own experience, is the only way to make a real choice
Right.
for
It's your
yourself.
choice. Exactly. Must
Yeah.
be your choice. Otherwise, you don't learn anything by making other people's choices. You have to make your own choice. And if that choice is suboptimal, if that choice is out of your fear and out of your ego and out of your beliefs, well, learn from that. If the result doesn't work out very well, then think back why. Maybe it was just bad luck. Maybe it was just not such a good choice. But you learn, and then you'll learn a little. And next time you'll make a little smarter choice. And the next time after that, smarter yet. And that's how you develop. That's your optimal path for development, not
But not,
following somebody else.
yeah,
Just
not what should I do, but what is authentic.
exactly.
And eventually you become aware that what is authentic is kind of a meter of your quality.
Exactly.
And
What should I do is living an image. It's becoming an actor.
mm,
Oh, I'm going to act in what I think is the right way, the proper way, even though that's not the way I am. Well, that may be civilizing if you act nicer than the way you actually are, because you think acting nice is the better way, but it's not going to help you grow up. It's better to just be who you are and say, oh, look, when I'm authentic, I'm not very nice. I should learn from that, because look at all these times I'm not very nice, and it leads to bad circumstances. It leads to, has poor consequences. If I were kinder, consequences, those negative consequences I reaped from my not being kind, will teach you something. That's the point, right? Be
and
authentic, make your choices, learn from them. Don't be afraid to make the wrong choice. Make your choice and then learn from it.
and conversely, um, making a choice that appeared to be not very nice, but was actually who you are, is possibly a better thing. Because nice isn't always nice. Seems to indicate acting or trying to be
Oh,
something. I don't know.
yeah.
You have to be considerate, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it
And
depends on how you define nice. Nice can be, if it's not sincere, nice can be a problem. Oh, I'm just being nice. I really dislike this person, and and I'm being nice to them anyway. Well, that's civilizing, but you're not going to grow because you're not really dealing with the real issue. You're sidestepping it. Or I'll be nice to that alcoholic and give him some money so he can buy another bottle of cheap wine. Well, now you're an enabler of bad behavior. You see, so what's good and what's bad, what's nice and what's not, really has to be judged on long-term entropy. In the long term, does it raise entropy or lower entropy? That's how we make our choices, not on whether it's a nice thing to do or not a nice thing to do, but how does it affect the entropy of the long term, the entropy of the system, which means yours and everybody else's. How does it affect the entropy of the system? If it lowers the entropy of the system, then that was a good choice. If it raises the entropy system, that was a bad choice. Whether it was nice or not, or whether it made people happy or made people sad, isn't necessarily what's important. does it help people grow up? Is it helpful?
Very well said. Thank you. All right, Tom, our next question is on reasons for choosing lifeless activities. I use my phone for hours on end, watching interesting videos on YouTube, searching the web for the latest in technology, going on Instagram, Facebook, scrolling endlessly to see the latest updates from my friends. It's strange because doing stuff, going for a walk, working, playing the piano, working out, these things seem so much more alive, but I still often choose to sit on my couch, lifelessly scrolling on my phone or sitting with my laptop surfing the web. How come I choose to do these lifeless activities so often? I've heard that the brain fires feeling good chemicals when we constantly get new impressions, but is this the main reason that I'm kind of high from doing this?
Oh, that's a question that probably millions of people, could be asking. That's a very good question. Lots of people spend a lot of time in social media and otherwise, engaged through, digital means rather than through, physical means. There's several reasons for that. And there's things, there's good and bad with that. Obviously, having those kinds of resources at your fingertips is very handy. You want to know something? Well, Google it, or, go to one of the other search engines, so it's really nice that you can gather information. You want to repair the rear view mirror on your, 14-year-old car? Well, Google it. There'll be a YouTube, video of that actual repair, and you'll learn something. So there's a lot of information there that is very useful. You get to meet people, you get to expand horizons. It's good, but you have to maintain a balance, and it becomes a problem when you get out of balance. Yes, part of the reason that you gravitate to that is that you do get a little puff of endorphin probably when something new or something interesting or a pretty picture shows up. Oh, look at that, a beautiful bird. The things that come across your social media, you do get a little shot of, oh, isn't that neat? Kind of a positive, a little positive shot of something when that happens. And that's nice. You get that. And that kind of makes you want to say, well, I wonder what else. I wonder what's come in since I started looking. Let's go back up to the top and see what news come in, because you're looking for that new little positive punch that you'll get when you see something interesting or new or something that grabs your attention, or the prettiest flower you've ever seen. A close up of an insect, with a multicolored wings and just beautiful and so on. Okay, so yes, we get something out of that, but we also find that that's easy. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to go anywhere. We can just sit and work our thumbs mostly. And I guess if you're on a computer, work your fingers, your thumbs, and your mouse, we punch keys and we roll a mouse around, and that's all we have to do. And we can get all these nifty things. So in a way, our system looks at that and says, oh, that's very efficient. I'm seeing all kinds of things. I've already seen, 20 beautiful colored birds today that don't live anywhere within 5,000 miles of where I live. Wow, I would never see those outside. So there's some advantages there. But if you only do that, or if you do that too many hours because it's easy and you do see a lot of interesting things that keep you engaged, okay, then your life becomes kind of one-dimensional. It's all digital. And you begin to lose the possibilities that are not digital, that are analog, out there in the analog world, all around you. You start losing those because the digital world is so easy, so inexpensive, You know, if you wanted to go see those pretty birds, it would probably cost you, you know, a $15,000 trip, you know, to South America or someplace, you know, in order to see them. And you see them right there on your screen. Not quite the same thing, but pretty close. So it's, again, a matter of balance. There are things in your environment that are not so much in the digital world. And most of those are called in-depth relationships. Now, you can have an in-depth relationship online, but it's a lot harder to actually obtain and maintain that depth than it is if you have that relationship with, you know, an analog being like you know, here in this world. It's not digital, but, you know, flesh and bone. So relationships, things like playing a musical instrument, yes, playing a piano, that's creative. That stimulates your creativity, your sense of aesthetic. You go out and walk in the park, that stimulates your sense of being in nature, being a part of your reality, not just being digits floating around in the digital space, but actually you're part of something else. Interacting with others, you know, you have brothers and sisters and parents and girlfriends and boyfriends and lovers and on and on and on, you know, neighbors, you have all these people in your life. And rather than just brush them off because, well, they're a lot of work, actually, you know, it's a lot of work getting to know your neighbors, actually more than just, you know, the first name and whether or not they're good at mowing grass or not. That's, it takes more work, it takes more effort, it takes time, but it also gives a lot back. You learn a lot that's important by being around other people, even just observing other people and observing yourself and how you interact with them and what your feelings are. See, when you're sitting there digitally, your feelings are kind of squished down into a little space. Oh, this feels good, but this doesn't feel too good, but yeah, nothing too deep there. The feelings all just rattle around in a little positive, a little negative. But when you get out in the real world, that tends to be richer in feelings, richer in connections. It's not as broad. Your digital reality is much broader. You say you can see stuff from all over the world there, but it's pretty shallow. Whereas your analog reality that's outside your door, that is not nearly as broad, but it can, if you take the effort and the time, be much, much deeper. So you need to explore both sides of your existence. There's a digital existence and there's the analog existence. You need to explore both. And because we tend to grow primarily from our deepest relationships, our relationships with the significant other. And I don't mean just romantic relationships, significant other. I mean, you know, it could be your children are also your significant others. It could be your parents are, it could be your neighbors are, it could be your best friend, you know, but people who are really, we're really close to them. They know us deeply. We know them deeply. That's where the rubber meets the road for the most part in getting rid of your fears and egos, because people that interact with you at a deep level are better at pressing your buttons and making you feel strongly, you know, very positively or very negatively, much more likely to happen in the analog world than in the digital world, which is another reason we escape to the digital world. That digital world doesn't stress us too much. You know, if we stay away from conspiracy theories and don't get, you know, down the rabbit hole into fear mongering and that kind of thing, then the digital world is always kind of a pleasant space. And if it isn't pleasant, well, we just click that little X in the corner and it's gone. You know, where if you have a neighbor that, you know, does something you don't like, well, you just can't push a little button at the corner and have that neighbor disappear. You got to deal with it. So we get into the digital space because it's easy. It's easy. We don't have to deal with depth. We don't have to deal with being hurt so much. We don't have to deal with being vulnerable. We don't have to deal with other people. So it's, in a way, it's an escape from the deeper, more meaningful, but also more difficult relationships in the digital world. So it can be a thing that kind of sucks us in because it's simple, it's easy, it's cheap, it's not too challenging. So that's the problem. If you get lulled into that, you'll be missing a lot of the challenges that you need to grow up. And yes, those challenges will hurt more, but they'll also be more static as well. You'll find more joy in them. You won't find a lot of joy on the internet. Oh, you can find little joyous emotions. Oh, that was a beautiful bird. Oh, joy. But it's not the same kind of joy that you can find in living a life, caring about other people, connecting, sharing. That the joy has much deeper and broader connections than it does online. So think of the, if we turn this into ecology and water, let's think that the internet's like a swamp, not very deep, but very, very broad. It's got all kinds of things in it, but it's not very deep. Whereas the analog world goes a lot deeper. It's a lot more developed in detail and depth and texture and, relationship and so on, but it's not nearly so broad. It's mostly just the people you interact with. It's probably, a dozen people or something. It's not real broad, but it's intense. And that intensity is a good thing, not a thing to run away from and hide in a digital world that doesn't get so intense, but to meet it and deal with it positively. That's where you grow up, not so much from the digital, but you really need both. I wouldn't say just go live in the analog world and forget the digital world. The digital world is an amazing, wonderful thing to have at our fingertips. By all means, use it. Just don't get out of balance with it. You have to know then it's time to put that phone down and walk out the door, call up somebody and, have a relationship, get connected. Live, find that joy, find that happiness, find that stuff that really makes you feel good. You won't find that so much online. You can search and search and search, but you won't find that so much online. Not that it's impossible and that nobody ever finds any of that online, but not so much. That's a rare commodity online. Whereas if you go out and start interacting, embracing relationships and people, you'll have all the challenge that you can use right there, even with that just dozen or so people that you run into, the people at work and so on. So that's the point. Balance it, do both, but only do both, in the ratio that makes the best sense for you. Everybody has to find their own balance point. It's not like there's just one balance point for everybody. But don't get it sound like you have realized that you're not too much in balance, that you're out of balance, that you're spending more and more time. You keep getting sucked into the digital world. Well, yes, you do get sucked into that. It's easy and it's fascinating, and it always is showing you something new and interesting. That's true, but it doesn't give back very much. It's generally constrained to a superficial level.
Thanks, Tom. That's good advice. Balance, I think, always. There are so many wonderful things to learn and to see on the internet, though. It is a lot of education out there, but balance is the key word. That's a good one. All right, the next question is functions to navigate in non-physical matter reality. Being aware of teleportation or changing data streams and a lack of space radically changed my perspective and allowed me to remove beliefs I was previously unaware of, which greatly expanded the possibilities available to me in NPMR. I was wondering if you would please elaborate more on what functions are possible in NPMR to help explorers navigate. For example, we are able to create occurrences based on intention, such as changing data streams, giving or receiving information, becoming objects or other forms. These functions that I am aware of, as incredible as they are, seem like a very small portion of what is possible. So, to clarify, what other functions are available to us in NPMR? And I think you are working on a program that's going to help develop the imagination in order to better um, navigate through non-physical reality in out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that the tool that I'm working on, but that's a tool, and it probably fits into this category of what are some other things that, what other functions are there that you can use. And one is that you are somewhat limited in how you interpret information. If you are, say, a very intellectual person, very left brain, intellectual, logical process oriented, then you will tend to interpret everything in terms of that mode. Everything will be, intellectual stuff. You won't get a lot of feeling information. You'll get just facts. Well, this happened, and that happened, and the other thing happened, and then I saw this, and then I saw that. That's just all intellectual stuff. But you'll miss a great deal of the feeling stuff that will come your way. Okay? If you only live your life, I shouldn't say only, but if you live most of your life just through your eyes and ears, what you see and what you hear, and all the rest of your senses are sort of there, but they're not really a big part of your life. What you touch, what you smell, what you taste, they're there, but it's not a big part of your life. Well, then you will interpret everything in terms of sight and sound. You won't get smells, you won't get feelings, you won't get tastes, because they're just not standard. That's not how you interpret data. So all of these things limit how you interpret the data. So you can modify the experience you have by making it richer, much richer experience, if you can include feelings, tastes, smells, emotional content. So if you have that, then your experience becomes, well, each one of those senses is another dimension, so it becomes a 5-dimensional space that you're in, one for each of the 5 senses. If you can interpret, if you're used to interpreting, if you're very facile at interpreting all of your sense data, the smell and the taste, as well as the sight and the hearing, then your out-of-body experiences will take on another dimension, because you do interpret what you get in terms of your experience. And if your experience is mostly just sight and sound, then all you'll get is sight and sound. So that's one thing. And yes, indeed, I am putting together a tool set that is going to be available at MBT events. And it'll be available for purchase. It'll be an interesting tool, I think, and it's going to help people develop their ability to function through all 5 senses, and their ability to translate like out-of-body experiences into those 5 senses. And it will also help them become more creative, more able to think out of the box. It will enable them to more easily experience things like out-of-body and remote viewing and other kinds of paranormal things. It kind of one will lead into the other, so that it is a kind of a training aid for people who would like to experience out-of-body, but are having a hard time getting their intellect to sit down and be quiet. They're having a hard time getting into their intuitive space, into their being level, and just staying there without that intellect constantly trying to judge and assess what's going on and why it's going on, and am I doing it right? And am I really doing that, or am I doing something else? All those are just judgments. That's the intellect, judging, trying to assess. And to get that to stop, then I've created this tool. So for those people that have difficulty getting to out of body, this tool I think will be very helpful if they work with it for a while. It's not going to be a magic pill. It's not like it'll instantly, make their intellect sit down and be quiet. But if they work with it routinely, consistently over, I don't know, even just a few months, it will start to make a difference, and they can practice at the things they really need to do, which is to function without their intellect calling all the shots. So, and like I say, it's good for creativity and thinking out of the box as well. And actually, it will enrich their life in this reality as well as their life in, other realities. It's kind of an enrichment course altogether. So that's one of the tools. Yes, it's talking about different things that you can do, different functions there that you can use. Another function that is not used as much is to realize that when you are in these adventures in the non-physical, you're experiencing some single player game, you're in it and action's happening and you're doing this and you're doing that and your places and things are happening. You can assert control over what happens with your intent. Here in this virtual reality, our intent can modify future probability. But in those realities, when we are in a single player game, our intent can modify future probability much more strongly and directly than it does in this virtual reality. And that's a function that probably almost nobody knows about. So that would be another one. If there's things that are happening or a situation that's set up, you can always take your intent and pretty easily rearrange it. In other words, you can write your own scripts. You can change the script as you go. You can add things, take things away. You can be co-creator with the system that's sending you that data stream. You don't have to just accept what you get. You can become a co-creator with the system in generating a particular data stream. And very few people are aware of that. So that gives you another whole dimension of interaction, where it's not just you log on and there's the game and you play it, but you can help define the game. You can help modify the game. And what happens is that you and the system, the LCS, become kind of co-creators of the game. So you may start the LCS's game and you may take it in a little different direction. And the LCS will pick up on that direction and feed that someplace else that otherwise maybe wasn't going to go. And it would take it someplace else. And then you may make another little twist in it. So where it actually ends up is a dynamic interplay between you and the system as to where it actually ends up. So there is that. So it's basically you get the LCS to play with you. You're in a virtual reality, but it's not just I'm logged on and I'll get whatever I get, but it's logged on and you can get the system to play with you, to interact creatively with what you're doing. So that is, I don't generally talk about that because most people are not at a level where they can actually use that. You have to be a little more advanced in the sense that, the out of body or cruising around in other reality systems has to be not a challenge for you, but you can make it a very interesting learning experience, or even just an interesting game. If you're just interested in a kind of a fun experience, the system has a good sense of humor. It can play with you there and create things for you. So you and the system can interact to modify the script of the game. So give that one a try and see how that works for you.
That is really interesting. I have not heard you talk about that before. Um, Super advice. Apparently, this person is adept at out-of-body experiences and would like a little more of a twist, and you certainly delivered that well in your answer. Um, so I'm sure he'll be very happy with that answer. Thank you very much, Tom, for all of the questions you've answered. It was an interesting session, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. It's been fun.
Tom Campbell here. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our newly created Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.